Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 14th of December. I sincerely apologize for this really long hiatus. December has been one of the busiest months I've encountered in a while. I don't have much of a choice but to not upload as a result. And so for the next couple of weeks, I probably won't be able to release a lot of videos. But whenever I get the chance, I'm going to squeeze one in like I am doing today. And it's important because over the past, what is it, like 11 days since I uploaded a video, you've had a really large amount of Russian momentum continue south of Uspenivka all the way to the area east of Pokrovsk. So you're looking at a relatively narrow part of the front line, but most of the significant updates have been concentrated in this area. And so I'm going to focus on it in today's video, but in future ones, I'll of course broaden my lens and look at areas like Toretsk and Kursk, where there were also notable Russian gains. But within this area alone, it's about 90 square kilometers captured over those 11 days. So like 8.2 square kilometers captured on a daily basis on average. So it is a consistent Russian pace, and it is focused on two areas in particular that I'm going to be looking at in today's video that I've warned about. I've warned about a Russian culmination that could lead to the capture of some really important areas, and now we're seeing that manifest in real time. We're going to look at that in addition to Ukrainian troop rotations and command changes in two posts that I think is really important to look at. But let's zoom in here and see south of Andrivka. Once again, Russian advances amounting to 2.3 square kilometers. They're continuing to take over open fields in areas that are slightly overlooking villages like Rozliv, Konstantinopil, generally the Vovcha River Valley and the roads connecting them together. But you can see that the pace has decreased in this region due to the presence of the 37th Marine Brigade. The same thing really happened around Rozdolnia and then also to the west in Novi Kamar, where the map is inaccurate. And I should be indicating that there is a Ukrainian presence there due to the Russian breakthrough being temporarily repelled. And a lot of that is due to this unit coming in to act as a really, really massive support factor for the territorial defense battalions that are operating in this region. And really, their goal originally was just to sort of soften the blow and protract the fighting. Now you actually have the 37th Brigade coming in and becoming more active in defense, and really coupled with the fact that the Russians are focusing on areas a bit to the east, means that the gains here have dwindled in recent weeks. In an area that have increased, though, is to the east, as we said, where you have Russian gains amounting to 18.6 square kilometers. This includes a 5-kilometer breakthrough northwards towards Sukhyali. This was recorded on December 8th from the 151st Mechanized Brigade, just them firing onto the houses there as the Russians were occupying them. 151st Brigade is a relatively new unit, really important for the Pokrovsk area over the past half year. And now at least some of its elements have been moved southwards to defend in generally the front, as I referred to it, but you could also say the Uspenivka pocket. So that's very important to note that key units that were defending in the Pokrovsk region were moved away to defend another critical area. You didn't see the movement of the Ukrainian units from a lower priority front to a higher priority front, but just from one high priority area to another. And that's probably due to the quality just being highest in these high priority areas. And that's what's being really needed and yearned for from the Ukrainian side at the moment. So you have here the Russians really putting a nail in the rear, a thorn in Ukraine's rear, you could say, because you have the Sukhyali River here and the Ukrainian troops that remain resisting for now 6 days in northern Sukhyali. They only have a width of about 400 meters between the line of contact and the river itself, which makes it very difficult to maneuver and to move north and south. But it is still possible because you do have some really narrow areas to cross over, and you have this paved road that then moves northwards and connects to the broader Andrivka area. So it's not the end of the world, but it is critical for the Ukrainians to continue holding up in this region, which of course then diverts resources, but it's needed in order to prevent any sort of additional encirclements from forming in areas south of the Kurokova countryside in villages like Kihand or Yantarnia. And of course, we're going to look at it now, but the village of Kostiantynopolske. You can see here from December 9th that this is a video from the Ukrainian side, just a compilation of their efforts to repel Russian attacks because they had an armored column launched from the Trudova region. I think it was like 4 vehicles involved. They advanced 1.2 kilometers northwards. And in the footage, you could see how the 505th Marine Battalion of the 37th Brigade was involved in artillery strikes targeting those Russian dismounts. You had massive armored vehicle, this British produced vehicle that they utilize, using actually high caliber machine gun fire towards the Russian vehicles and the troops dismounted in the tree lines leading into the houses. So that's from December 9th. And since then, there's just been continued clashes here. So you're seeing a sort of similar scenario wherein the Russians can succeed in a breakthrough because they have the ability to just dominate the fields leading into a village. But once they enter into it, the Ukrainians at that point have no choice but to defend because their backs are across the river and they don't want to lose the entire southern riverbank. And so it's a sort of equation that leads to higher casualties. But at a certain point, the front line does temporarily stabilize. So in this case, we're talking about a matter of days. So it's not anything long term, but just enough to give the Ukrainians that are located even further east, that are in even more dire straits, the ability to continue dragging out the fighting and then gradually withdrawing whenever that order is given. But in a lot of cases, the Ukrainians, and we've seen this over the past year especially, have tried to hold out for an extremely long period of time and then pull out in a way that is extremely fast. And during that pullout, if it's conducted or not timed properly, because we're talking about very small margins of error when you're looking at the Russian side and their movements and their ability to utilize firepower. If it's not timed to a T, then you have really a lot of lives. You're looking at dozens, if not hundreds of lives being put at stake, of at least capture by the Russian side, if not being killed or wounded. Not to mention all of the equipment that could be lost during such a withdrawal. And so I'm really referring to the Uspenivka pocket with this entire tangent because you had previously, before I changed the entire map with the yellow polygon, the Ukrainians in control of all of Uspenivka and then villages such as Vesely High, Hanivka, Romanivka, western part of Yelizavetivka, parts of Ilinka, etc. And so it was very narrow. So everyone was aware of that. And you had very enormous Ukrainian investments along these strongholds in the northern and southern parts of the corridor, which were able to hold out for, uh, you know, 3 months if we're being generous, ever since September. That's when the pocket really began to form in earnest. And you're looking now at the crack that really broke the camel's back, or the straw that broke the camel's back, would be with the advance south of Dalnya. In this region, there was a very deep Russian breakthrough. I'm going to show you guys the extent of it over here. You can see it amounts to about 3 kilometers. And when we're talking about a corridor which really extends 5 kilometers, it has a very deep density of Ukrainian forces. That is a significant amount. And so you could see here some of the footage from the encounter where you had the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment, Russian unit, raise their flag in Uspenivka in the eastern portion. So not all of it is under Russian control. Even now, the fighting there continues to go on back and forth. And you could see just further confirmation of Russian presence based on this footage from the 138th Reconnaissance Battalion, just conducting FPV strikes onto individual Russian vehicles and grenade drops onto Russian infantry operating in the warehouses of Uspenivka. Now, the fact that the Russians were able to attack from the rear over here, it's not surprising because they were able to capture Dalnya, which really then allows the Russians to radiate from that area in all directions. But it is really bad development for them because they were able to reach this Seltralna road, and anything to the east of it was then cut off from direct access to the wider Ukrainian rear in an area like Andrivka. Of course, it is still possible, but we're looking at very narrow corridors through which the advances are possible. And so any movement back and forth into the pocket, so I'm talking about into an area like Vesely High or into Hanivka, and then back, is done in a really urgent manner where there's no room for error because any chance of being spotted or any chance of being caught lacking, you could say, it could lead to fire and then being spotted. And it's just an extremely dangerous situation for the battalions that were tasked with holding onto this area and continue to do so. So, for instance, in the excess regions like Western Yelizavetivka, at this point, the Russians have taken them over, but really after very long, protracted Ukrainian resistance. So here's footage from December 11th of Ukrainian sappers that were still operating in the western houses over here, being ambushed and killed by Russian troops advancing through the residential areas. So now they've succeeded in taking it over in its entirety. Also, Romanivka, you have here the 242nd Regiment. They advanced from the Elinka direction and pushed then further westwards into Hanivka. And they raised on December 5th their flag in Romanivka. From there, of course, they advanced along this sort of main road, Shevchenko Road, and made it all the way to here, Hanivka. This was done by the 3rd Battalion of the regiment. they entered in. They also raised their flag atop the skeleton of a destroyed armored vehicle, December 13th, so today. Western Hanivka, so far, it's not confirmed that the Russians are in the process of capturing that yet. There's fighting back and forth in a lot of these villages. A lot of the gray zone has not been clarified yet because you have these massive pockets of open fields where it's not really entrenched. And so I'm not sure as to what's the extent of any Russian or Ukrainian presence at this current moment in time. And so then you have these just massive areas, massive circles that I'm going over in red over here, where we're unsure about the situation, but there's just no feasible way for the Ukrainians to continue holding on when it comes to what the Ukrainians are trying to muster together. At least as of today, as of now, it would be the area just east of Uspenivka, which includes open fields and includes mostly the area north of the Sukhyali River connecting to Western Hanivka. And then perhaps there are some excess areas further southeastwards, including in this field region and just near Romanivka and Yelizavetivka. But these pockets, they really now have a really no other choice but to withdraw further westwards because the talk as of December 12th, so 2 days ago at night, December 12th at night, from Ukrainian sources, was the possibility of an encirclement due to the push coming in from the west from the Uspenivka region. And so far, it's not been clarified whether or not there ever was an encirclement, or if there was, if the Russians have taken over the pocket completely and taken POWs, or if the Ukrainians broke out, or if there was just a Ukrainian general withdrawal order given 2 days ago. And that sort of confusion was what led to the theory of a pocket being formed in the first place. Those are all legitimate possibilities. But what we do know for sure, at the very least, is that the Russians took over here 3.06 square kilometers, and then here 13.2 square kilometers, and then in Vesely High 3.22 square kilometers. So here we can see the footage from Vesely High. Again, 138th Reconnaissance Battalion, very important due to the drones being utilized, and then they're important with close quarters fighting and just reconnaissance on the Russian side. They dropped the grenades onto Russian infantry, taking over the hamlet. And then here you have the 39th Motor Rifle Brigade, Russian units raising their flag atop destroyed armored vehicle. So that was actually in Vesely High. In Hanivka, the video was just from them entering into houses. So again, for whatever remnants of the Ukrainian operatives are here, their window of opportunity to withdraw continues to become more and more difficult, and then the fighting sort of just drags out in Uspenivka in order to just buy them little bit more of time. But looking forward, you do have a lot of strongholds north of the Sukhyali River that are now going to be under threat of Russian capture, and then that has a lot of implications for the rest of the villages along the river valley and for the trenches south of Kurakove that will now be sort of facing Russian forces directly, and they'll of course be next on the chopping block from a Russian perspective. So that will help further move things with the urban battle going on in Kurakove and with its western environs, you could say. Looking at the Kurakove area, you can see that there have been Russian advances. I would say a lot of it is being pushed by the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade. They advanced here in the area north of Pivdenia and have entered into the district to a certain extent. They've taken over a lot of private residential areas that are just one story, and then have nearby plantations, and from there pushed into actual apartment buildings. So a lot of these regions are now a gray zone, and the fighting continues to drag out with the 46th Air Assault Brigade really involved with the fighting here. Clashes in every single apartment building, utilizing the dense structure and the concrete slabs to their advantage, and then also doing the same thing with this part of Western Krakow, where you just have a massive concentration of apartment blocks, an area that the Russians have not really infiltrated into as of now. The area where they have had the successes in the southern part of this entire apartment block district. So this is from December 12th. It's just of the 46th Brigade, a compilation of FPV strikes onto a lot of vehicles, some of them being unarmored actually, but then also houses where the Russian troops were being stationed. And so that area is now under Russian control, and it does further isolate Pivdenia to see those Russian gains to the northwest, and it's being done again along, let's see which roads are mentioned over here. I'll also go to the north. You could see here that the Russians were able to take 1.5 square kilometers. A lot of it is related to this grain elevator being captured and then nearby warehouses, in addition to local shopping facilities and gardens, private residential areas, expanding all the way westwards to the local administrative building, courts building here as well, and the general infrastructure for the reservoir. So the Russians have now reached that location. They're continuing to advance along Prospect Road, and also just any remaining private residential areas east of the apartment complexes are now in a gray zone. The fighting here is becoming more and more difficult because the houses are becoming flattened and there's no such cover. There are some basements you could assume, but not anything like the basements that are present in the apartment buildings. And those are the areas where the Ukrainian troops that are fighting, the platoons and the companies, are staying overnight in those basements. You can't say the same thing for the area a bit to the east, which is why I'm marking it now as a gray zone. These are the areas that the Russians have been keen on taking over first because it's just less costly than going in gung-ho into really, really dense apartment complex. And all of this is being done from the perspective of, pushing in from the east to the west, ignoring the fact that there are also now flanks that the Russians can begin to utilize to further speed up the process of the urban battle in Kurakova, but not just there, but also more generally with the power plant and with the entire industrial area, which is also extremely important for the Russians to capture. Looking to the north here, Stary Terny, the Russians have been able to take over this village. It's amounting to 3.37 square kilometers of territory captured in total. Let's zoom in over here. You'll see that there is a geolocation from, I believe it is the Hydra drone units, or actually it's the Yokai drone units. This is one of those FPV units associated with the 35th Marine Brigade, and it's from December 6th, indicating Russian presence along this sort of coastal region of the Kurakova Reservoir. A lot of the dachas in the hamlets were taken over, in addition to the dense shrubbery and local stronghold. So this is important because it gives the Russians this key foothold along a paved route that leads to, I believe this is called Shevchenko, but I can't see on the map. And then from there, it's already Andrivka. So an eastern entrance is now a really possible scenario because of the Russians already having control of this foothold and not experiencing a significant amount of pushback since. It also means that the Ukrainians located in this pocket to the north are in a lot of trouble. You can see how they're not even based on a single trench stronghold or, say, a village. It's just Ukrainians that are remaining and resisting in an open field sandwich in between two villages captured by the Russians, and that is something that they're doing obviously in order to buy time for the eastern flank of Andrivka, but it is also extremely risky, as we've seen with a lot of the other pockets discussed in today's video. The Russians are closing in on. Here, east of the rail line, the Russians have taken over open fields amounting to 4.6 square kilometers. Around Uspenivka, the Russians have captured 2.6 square kilometers, and then to the west, they've taken over much of the residential buildings leading up to a local tree line and some of the sort of valley inlets. So here, the total amount of territory captured is 8.8 square kilometers. It also includes the capture of Zoria, which we'll get to in a second. But to zoom in over here, there is footage indicating the Russian capture of Solnsivka. There's footage here from December 5th of FPV strikes onto armored vehicles, Russian vehicles that were able to make it to the southern tip of the village and then dismount forces. So the houses were also hit in said footage. So now you're seeing that for the most part, the residential areas are captured. It's more so about securing nearby Ukrainian locations. And what I say by that would be this area over here. I'm going to mark it with this red color for you guys so you understand what I'm referring to. But there are Ukrainian defending across this line. And it's understandable because it's one of the final lines of defense that the Ukrainians could use that is relatively solid due to some trenches which you could see on the map or are there but just weren't identified yet on satellite imagery that are based around dense shrubbery, and then also around villages like Petropavlivka and Slovyanka. So this line that is west of Sontsivka really is one of the final opportunities for the Ukrainians to stabilize the front line before the Russians get this like really important hook coming in from the north to attack all of the trenches, all of the strongholds that are defending the northern flank of Andrivka. So it's completely understandable why the Ukrainians are digging in this area. They're doing so with an assortment of units, including the 35th Marine Brigade. That's one of the most notable. But they're on the map over here, such as let's click on all of them. There are a few local battalions, territorial defense units, but then also here you have 59th Brigade. 59th Brigade is operating with its battalions split up, some of them committed to the area directly to the west of Sontivka, and others having responsibilities a bit further to the north. But barring territorial defense units and some battalions like the 21st Separate Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade, and then also the 108th Mechanized Battalion, I believe that's attached to the 59th Brigade nowadays. Besides them, there is a bit of a lower priority on this particular area, whereas a lot of the reinforcements have occurred a bit to the north in areas like Novotroitsk and Shevchenko, which we'll get to later on in the video. Looking at Zoria, the Russians have been able to capture this. They advanced 3 kilometers westwards from the Novodmitrivka area. You can see our geolocation from December 6th. This is from the Hydra drone units. It's a part of the 137th Marine Battalion, one of the key local units involved with the fighting here. So they just conducted individual FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers that were occupying the hamlets. Again, this is one of the few villages in the nearby region. Again, you have, of course, Slovyanka, Petropavlivka that we talked about, sort of serving as a final Ukrainian line of defense, and the Russians taking over Zoria gives them a perfect base to then push forward and take over those locations. Also, it gives them the opportunity to coalesce with the Russian gains south of Pushkine and again push westwards towards an area like Novoolonivka and Yasunove, Ukrainka, this entire junction of villages running along this vertical road. And this is an area where you actually do have a bit of density in terms of Ukrainian settlements, but the area south of it is largely open. It's an area that is perfect in opportunity for deep Russian penetrations. The Ukrainians are aware of this, and they are also aware of the fact that there is less density in defense here. There are not a lot of reserves located over here, and then just static defenses were not built nearly enough, which means the Russians will have a massive advantage in order to get and coalesce control over a large swath of territory, pushing towards the border between Donetsk and Dnipro Oblast. But for the time being, a lot of the objectives will surround taking over areas where there actually is strong Ukrainian resistance to ensure that it cannot act as a fallback line for any sort of future Russian operation if they were to advance in this area. Looking at Pushkine, just south of it, the Russians advanced 3.3 square kilometers, taking over open fields, whereas the village itself is still located partially in a gray zone. There's not enough elaboration on what's going on with the northern houses over there. A very interesting area, and this is a region that actually learned about extensively, would be the region between Novotroitsk and Shevchenko. We looked originally at the post-Selidova bloom, wherein the Russian forces were able to continue pressing on their momentum and advance along key and very narrow routes, especially along this one rail line. And it's, of course, you know, windbreaks that run along it as well. In the process, they took over key villages that you can see on the map and then expanded westwards towards areas like Novoaleksivka, Yurivka, and Pustinka. This culminated with the capture of Zovtve, which was really a push even further northwestwards, and it was done along a very specific front. And as a result of this capture, the Russians really were able to unlock a lot of new opportunities, new routes to then, really penetrate into Ukraine's rear in this area. So you're looking at a gain of 17 square kilometers. It is a lot within a narrow period of time, with the maximum advance of 6 kilometers westwards. The Russian forces, they utilized the rail line to advance northeastwards towards Vidrozhenia, which is an important village in the sense that it then feeds into Zelenya and Achenske. And then you have threats of this entire open field region north of Petrivka falling into Russian hands. This entire region, which would be a massive vacuum to take over, would give the Russians a massive buffer zone between their newly acquired territory, which will then become like a sort of local forward command center or logistics node, which they can then use to feed into the new front line further northwards. It would just be a perfect buffer and give the Russians further impetus to advance along the E50 highway towards various villages on the, I suppose, third to last line of defense before actually reaching Pokrovsk itself. Because you're looking at the first line of defense being Shevchenko to Jechenske, second line of defense being, I suppose, Zvirove over here all the way to Novoukrayinka and Chudishine, and there are some trenches to sort of reflect that. And then the final line being, of course, Pokrovsk itself and the Shakhtarsky district and some other suburbs. So you could understand why the Russians are now pushing in this area now that they've found a weak point. And I was warning about this weak point west of Zhovte, both because of the advance towards Vidrozhenia, but also because of Shevchenko. You look at Shevchenko, the Russians have been able to enter into this village from the west. It's relatively large in relation to some of the others in this area. And I said it would be the true test of whether the Russians will be able to continue pushing over here after the fall of Sledove, where they were able to gain so many villages along the Solona River. And we're seeing now the Russian progress in real time. We're seeing that here there's geolocation from December 6th of the tank battalion of the 59th Brigade, and they fired towards Russian positions in southern Shevchenko. And then you fast forward 6 days, and you have here footage from a Russian soldier individually storming a house and throwing into it a grenade and using a thermobaric launcher to attack the occupants inside. So this indicates further Russian gains. You could also see here from December 13th, Scala battalion with their own compilation, utilizing a tank, firing at Russian positions in the local school over here. There's also FPV strikes and M117 armored vehicle firing at the local Russian points of contact where they're located. And so now much of Shevchenko has been taken over by the Russians. The eastern section, which sort of connects to Pokrovsk along this key highway, is still under their control. And in the north, you do have localized counterattacks being conducted by Scala and the 33rd Assault Battalion, also by the 155th Mechanized Brigade. So there is some fighting over here, and the Ukrainians are in an area like this specifically losing a lot of equipment in relation to other areas because we don't see them conduct localized counterattacks everywhere. This is a very specific area, and it's completely understandable because this region, if it were to fall into Russian hands, Shevchenko would give the Russians a really huge key to push along this road into Shakhtarsky and then also along this paved road into the western parts of Pokrovsk, putting a lot of pressure on its southern flank, onto its western supply lines, onto its lines of defense. It's absolutely critical that Shevchenko remain under Ukrainian control in order to provide that buffer for the entire Pokrovsk garrison. And that's why they're throwing in a lot of their modernized equipment, a lot of equipment from the 155th Brigade coming in from just newly acquired French stockpiles. And the unit only made it back to Ukraine about a month ago, a bit less than that actually. And recently it announced a leadership change. So Taras Maximov, he's a colonel. He's going to be the new commander of the brigade. He replaces Oleg Kosovsky. He's a lieutenant colonel, and he was the leader or the commander of the unit for like 2 to 3 months. Previously, there was another commander who had like a lot of experience, and he was removed during the summer, interestingly. And so now this is the third leadership change for a brigade that was only created this year, and it has only now for a couple of weeks been fighting in the front line. It was thrown immediately into the deep end into a very difficult part of the front line, admittedly. And so probably the change is due to now understanding of the frontline dynamics and needing somebody who's actually going to be accustomed to that and can deal with the intensity of the fighting over here. Because the previous appointment he was described as temporary, so it's not a complete surprise to us, but it does show that definitely the Ukrainians that were recruited from this unit, probably 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers at least with modernized equipment and French training, even they are experiencing difficulties in this part of the front line due to the Russian focus on it, due to being one of their key theaters at the current moment. And it's not just a brigade level change that occurred. You also had a larger change that occurred. You had the head of the Donetsk operational tactical grouping. His name is Alexander Lutsenko. He was fired, and it was described as being due to Russian advances in Pokrovsk. So probably this breakthrough and also the one to Novotroitska. And he was replaced by Alexander Tarnovsky. And Tarnovsky, he is well known. I think you might have heard of him actually from last year during the counteroffensive. He was described, or he was actually the deputy head of Operational Command East for a while, starting in like mid 2022. He led the operational strategic grouping that attacked during the Kherson offensive and was able to take back the city. He was involved in the operational command of Zaporozhye during the counteroffensive. And then he also was involved in fighting in Avdiivka. He was a leader of the operational strategic grouping over there. And so he's been really involved and meshed into fighting for an extremely long period of time. One of Zelensky's favorites, I would say. And now he's being appointed to the Donetsk region. He's going to be involved in the defensive activities in the Pokrovsk region and more generally with the Donetsk offensives that the Ukrainians are trying to defend against. Besides Shevchenko, which is very important, you also have these Russian gains that it pushed westwards, taking over Novopustinka. Here you can see December 5th, the Puma drone group dropping grenades onto Russian forces in western Novopustinka. And then also here, Ukrainian armored vehicle was damaged during a counterattack in the eastern part of Novotroitsk. You have Novotroitsk as a very important village because it's sort of as an access point, not just to the Pokrovsk region, but also to this chain of villages that runs along the Solona River all the way to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. So it's a relatively large one, and again, serves as a litmus test for how strong the Russian garrison here really is and how far they could really push the mantle. So there's a couple of videos just confirming Russian presence in this area that I'm just going to click on quickly. 11th National Guard Brigade is involved with the defense here. They conducted FPV strikes onto farmland in the southern part of the village. 33rd Assault Battalion, they killed a Russian soldier that was retreating from positions a bit further south of the village, indicating that the Russians are actually present along this highway. This highway then leads to other populated areas in a valley, starting in Novo-Olenivka all the way to Nadivka. And so that's something to look out for in the future, whether the Russians begin to utilize this highway to attack southwards. They also did expand westwards. This is based on footage from the Big Cats and the 33rd Assault Battalion. They shelled a tree line west of Novotroitsk. Now the Russians, if you're measuring it, are only about 2 kilometers away from Novovasilivka. So that's very important to keep an eye out for because they also have access to this key paved road leading directly into the village. Also, some other pieces of footage indicating Russian control near the Solona River. So this is from the 11th National Guard Brigade. Once again, FPV strikes. Here again, 11th Brigade FPV strikes, and here's 15th National Guard Brigade. They conducted grenade drop attacks onto Russian forces advancing along the road across the Solona River to Novotroitsk. So now you have this area of ambiguity in between Novotroitsk and Pischane, where a lot of fighting will continue, where you're going to have the Ukrainians trying to take advantage of the gray zone to conduct localized counterattacks. It's a 3 kilometer area before reaching another populated region on the road to Pokrovsk or its western flank. And so this is an area that definitely the Ukrainians, including the 150th Reconnaissance Strike Battalion, are going to play a key role in trying to contain. You have reinforcements from the 59th Tank Battalion as well involved in defense here. 25th Airborne Brigade is also involved in defense, including its 3rd Battalion, which has been very active with the just defense with drones, but also actually utilizing vehicles and infantry and fighting with the Russian forces. Skala Battalion was not always present in this area around Shevchenko. It was previously involved in localized counterattacks to the east around Myrhorod, and we're going to look at that region in a second. You also have a few other units that recently have come in to contribute to the defense, including the Immaterium or Korn Group, which is a part of the 116th Mechanized Brigade. It was previously around the Kursk region, I believe, but now it is defending in this region and will provide a lot of support from the drone perspective, in addition to the Birds of Magyar drone unit, which is also active in this region. Zooming in, you could see east of Jechenske, Ukrainians hitting 2 armored vehicles that were advancing on December 8th. Again, Jechenske is on this sort of first line of defense before pushing deeper in depth towards Pokrovsk. But the fall of Jechenske would then give the Russians access to the actual strongholds that are involved with the defensive perimeter of Pokrovsk, and also a key highway, the E50 highway, pushing directly into Hanativka and then into the city itself. So it's a very important village that for the Ukrainians to maintain a full control over. But the Russians also made inroads into Lysivka. So here on December 12th, it's a Birds of Magyar video, 16-minute video of just FPV strikes continuous. So here, one of them was geolocated to Lysivka itself, where the Russians have been able to advance, just take over another part of the southern road. So that's important to note as the Russians chip away at Ukrainian holdings along this entire line. Also, a bit to the east, you have here Russians capturing 0.7 square kilometers. It's west of Krasny Yar. This is a very important location because the Skala battalion has been immense when it comes to holding on to this entire sort of semicircle. The semicircle that is north of Novohorodivka includes mine number 3 and also includes local strongholds. Now, one of them has been taken over by the Russians subsequently, following the movement of the battalion, the sub battalion, to defend in the region westwards in Shevchenko. So that is just obvious cause and effect as to why that occurred. The Ukrainians, sort of being overstretched and not having the manpower to maintain control over these excessive regions, even though it provides such a good buffer for the Myrhorod defense garrison, and also to prevent the Russians from taking over this rail line and just advancing along it as they do in so many other locations to reach the outskirts of key cities. So that was the rationale behind the Ukrainians even being present in this pocket and salient. But now the Russians have chipped away at it significantly due to this advance by taking over this local trench stronghold. This is from December 13th, 3rd Battalion of the 25th Brigade. FPV strike onto a soldier that was located west of the trench, indicating Russian control in that particular location. So we'll have to see if the movement of some, local forces from this region a bit to the west is going to play a role in then allowing the Russians to capture a lot of the open fields that are separating the line of contact from Myrnihad, because there are not a lot of settlements over here, just some fields, tree lines, and trenches. And it's a 3.8 kilometer region. But it appears that the Ukrainians are going to try to counteract that by moving in the 3rd Battalion to defend in this particular area. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Now, I do apologize for not being able to make the video any longer to look at other areas, but hopefully this was a comprehensive summary, and we'll be able to build off of this for future videos and make them even more informative. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.